drug testing, what employers need to know. So this is a changing topic. I remember when I was first becoming a supervisor, many years ago, the company I worked for, we did drug testing. That was just a standard part of onboarding. But for a whole bunch of reasons, I think culturally and legally, fewer and fewer companies do that today. And making it more complex is the ever-changing fabric of, just hit it on the head, legalization of marijuana, right? So still illegal at the federal level, legal in many states, but it's kind of a patchwork of laws that no state is like the other one exactly. So this is a really complex issue for employers. And it's really important to know what you can do, what you can't do, and maybe just some practical advice what you should do. So if you're a regular watcher of the show, great guest to unpack this for me today. Brian Shanker, he's an attorney at the Long Island, New York office of Jackson Lewis. Brian's practice focuses on representing employers in a wide range of workplace matters, as well as preventative advice and counseling. Brian has extensive experience defending class action and collective action lawsuits under federal and state wage and hour laws. He has successfully defended wage and hour audits conducted by the U.S. and New York State Departments of Labor. And Brian regularly handles cases before courts and administrative agencies involving claims of discrimination, sexual harassment, and retaliation. Brian, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me, Mike. And yeah, it's a great topic again today. As you mentioned, lots of stuff going on here. Not always so clear cut, but we're going to do our best to unpack it today.
So let's start with something that might just sound like the Captain Obvious question, but I really do think it's important to clarify what it is we're talking about. What is a pre-employment drug test?
Sure. So, there are a number of different types of drug tests, right? Pre-employment is a very common one where, basically before, the employee starts, and we're talking about, generally post-offer, someone is going to be tested for certain drugs. And, depending on what they may test positive for or not, the company can take, certain actions. We'll also discuss, other types of testing today, like, reasonable suspicion or post-accident or random drug tests. And there's similar, things to, concerns and restrictions that we'll discuss. But really, as it relates to pre-employment, it really must follow a conditional offer of employment, right? This isn't something that you're just having, every applicant, take a drug test. It's something where someone who the company makes an offer to will then be, given a drug test. If we do it too early in the process, it could raise Americans with Disability Act considerations. So that's why we want it later on in the process.
Can you say why? I think I understand probably why. Why would inserting drug testing as part of your filtering and screening process potentially put you up to be in violation of ADA?
Right. So I think there are probably two big reasons, that we're going to avoid that. In terms of the ADA, right, we don't want it to appear that any employment decision is being made, based on things like this. So if we're, screening every applicant for these types of drugs, again, that could raise issues that, there's some protections out there, especially under the ADA for, people who are being treated for instance, alcoholism or other, drug dependence. And so, while the ADA might not permit, drug use out on the job, there might be reasons why someone could test positive and, still be protected from, an adverse action. Now, aside from the ADA, if we're drug testing, applicants, before the offer stage, you can imagine, that could get costly, right? We're talking about, a high number of drug tests. And again, that's going to be both administratively and financially, burdensome to a company. And I think another, best practice, is just that, employees really, also, even when we do this, we don't want them to work, before we get the results. It's all a balancing act of when in the process to do it. And so we find that, post offer, but before working is that sweet spot of when you would want to do a pre-employment drug test.
And I think this feels kind of obvious, but I think probably important to clarify. And part of why this is a complex issue today is, what are there certain classes of drugs? I mean, nicotine is a drug. Alcohol is a drug. They're wide mainstream. You got to be a certain age to buy them and consume them. Cigarettes and beer and wine, alcohol. But with the advent of legalization of marijuana, all of a sudden these waters get a little bit murkier. I think it's pretty clear. Maybe it's okay to drug test for cocaine, for meth, for whatever. But can you put some rails around this for the types of things that's okay to be drug testing for?
Right. So I think you mentioned marijuana. We'll dive into marijuana and testing for that and CBD in a bit. There's that more than any other aspect of this is very much evolving at both the federal and state level. So we'll jump into those. But I think for other types, look, if we look at the federal level and the Omnibus Transportation Employee Testing Act, which applies to safety-sensitive, transportation employees in a number of different industries. We can look to them that they test for, among other things, cocaine, amphetamines, opioids, PCP. So, those are, the main things that we're looking at. But there are, a number of other, there are all sorts of other things that can be tested. And, we'll also get into the use of, a medical review officer, commonly called an MRO, which is someone who, the company should use. It's a physician, a doctor who would review the results of a drug test before they get to the company and potentially go over the results, discuss any issues on the drug test with the employee or applicant. Because, looking to the ADA, right, there could be, legitimate reasons why someone tests positive for something, right? It could be as a result of a medication they're on, right? And just as anything else, right, we're not going to, it's not advisable to take action against someone because of, something they've been prescribed by a doctor. Or if we're going to, we at least need to have, the understanding of, what's going on there. So, and at the same time, they're all different types of, drug tests. There's, urine, hair, blood, different things. And, I don't claim to be a medical professional, but, there are, might be reasons to, look into some types of tests over others. And that's all something that an employer should look into before they actually start testing, so that they have a policy, they know what the steps are for all this testing.
My mind's going all kinds of different directions to ask all kinds of edge questions. I think let's, for sake of time and just practicality for why people probably are tuning in to watch this or listen to this, let's maybe start with the center at the basics here. What types of employers are actually required to perform drug tests? And then what I think I'm assuming is going to be the majority of our audience. The next step was, what are the ring, the circle around that? Who would we maybe recommend, or it's okay to be doing drug testing? And then we can talk about the gotchas that everybody needs to be on the lookout for. So is there a center here where it's actually required to drug test?
Right. So, Yes. So I mentioned earlier the Omnibus Transportation Employee Testing Act. So this applies to safety-sensitive employees in aviation, trucking, railroad, mass transit, pipelines, and other transportation industries. And while there are different agencies, federal agencies that oversee the act as to each industry, generally all of these types of workers, should be, tested for drugs and alcohol if there's reasonable cause or reasonable suspicion that the employee might be under the influence of drugs or alcohol while they're on the job. So that's one area. And then there's certain requirements for them under the Omnibus Act. There's random drug testing that's required. And there's also, in addition to the testing, employers are supposed to give drug and alcohol awareness training to all employees, and also supervisors are given training in how to spot substance abuse, right? How to detect it. Because again, when we're dealing with safety-sensitive employees, which this act focuses on, that's a key concern. And so there are other types of employees who are, required to be drug tested, whether it, falls under, federal or state or even local laws. Certain government positions you can imagine, hospitals and healthcare, construction type positions are sometimes required, even law enforcement, sometimes, private security. So there are a number of different industries, and you can kind of see what's in common with these in that it's either, sensitive positions with respect to, information, or it's safety issues. And so, that's where we mainly see the requirements for
Brian,
testing.
Those feel like industries that if I'm listening to this show today, it's probably self-evident that I know that I am required. Is there an authoritative source that people can go to see, okay, is my business actually required by law?
Yeah, so I think the Omnibus, Transportation Employee Act, that's the first place to start. That's going to tell you. And if you have questions beyond that, then of course I think speak to a professional like an HR professional at Assure or an attorney if you have any doubt. Because if there are requirements and you're not testing, there can be there can be significant repercussions. Not to mention just the safety issues that could be caused to other workers. Now, there are some other laws in this area that, I think there's a common misconception by, federal contractors, for instance, that, they're required to drug test when that's actually not the case. So, there's the Federal Drug-Free Workplace Act. This applies to federal contractors with contracts over $100,000 or who receive, federal grant. And it doesn't actually require drug testing. What it does require is establishment of a drug-free workplace. So that means a drug-free awareness program to educate employees about drug abuse, right? A drug-free a written policy. And then, a counseling and rehabilitation program for those who might need it. So again, it's important to understand where your business falls in because, as we'll discuss later, there might be some restrictions. And so on what drug testing can be done. And so simply saying, hey, I'm a federal contractor, I'm required to do drug testing, that's actually not necessarily the case. There's drug free requirements, but not necessarily testing. Similarly, the ADA, the Americans with Disability Act, does not require testing, but we'll be mentioning the ADA a lot today because as we go through these drug testing issues, there's always the question of whether we're discriminating against applicants or employees because of a disability. And while the ADA doesn't necessarily it does not protect people who use drugs, in the workplace or alcohol in the workplace. It does protect employees who, for example, are recovering alcoholics or those who have obtained treatment for drug addiction, and so again, that's why, as I mentioned before, use of an MRO, a medical review officer, because there could be significant issues that just looking at a positive drug test result doesn't indicate alone.
All right, so we talked about so there are some types of employers that it is legally required, right? And they generally have to do with safety. What other types of industries are you seeing maybe a trend or maybe just a recommendation if you're giving counsel to a business owner that, hey, they really should consider drug testing, and maybe as if not more important, why would you make that recommendation?
Yeah. So I think, look, what are the main reasons that employers might conduct drug or alcohol testing? The ones that I see are, ensuring safety of the company's own employees or customers or others on premises. So, with respect to that, we're looking at people in positions that have safety consequences, right? Heavy equipment operators, warehouse roles, construction. And again, that goes right into the other issue of, reducing the risk of injuries and damage to that equipment. Often, but even outside of that, look, there are many workers in offices, for instance, that have access to sensitive data, whether it's financial data, customer data, things like that, where we want to, ensure that, we have, people who are going to be trustworthy in these situations. And again, drug testing, can also improve productivity and efficiency and morale, right? When we're not dealing with, the consequences of someone who might be under the influence. And, again, I think what I've also seen is that companies that are upfront about drug testing, it might actually discourage applicants in the first place who are, drug abusers from, applying for positions. So there's some deterrent effect there. So I think, look, it could be something that any company could use, whether, you're in that typical, safety affecting, roles and, machinery, things like that. But those companies with office employees, it's something that they can consider too. And again, it could even have consequences of reducing turnover and associated hiring costs. But in terms of initial considerations, right? I mean, the first question obviously is, are you required by law to conduct testing, which we discussed. And if there's any question, right, an employer should seek advice on that. The next is, again, we can't address all, city and state laws, but, are there any, local laws regulating workplace drug testing? And then, again, companies, there's positive sides to this too, right? You might be in a jurisdiction where having a drug and alcohol testing policy could, qualify the company for a workers' compensation premium discount. Not to mention, if there are accidents, if something does occur because of drug abuse on the job, but you have a program and a testing program, that could potentially reduce the company's liability because it's something that's been, looked at and taken seriously. Nothing is 100% fail-proof, but it can, have, liability benefits, for a company.
Brian, one of the things you and I have talked about several times in the show, Mary and I, our mutual friend Mary Simmons as well, part of the guidance here is, I think I don't know how to phrase it. It used to be much, I'd say, socially acceptable to drug test because almost from a moral basis, right? It's like, oh, drugs bad. We don't want people who do drugs good. But now because there's so much between, and I know we're going to jump into legalization of marijuana real quick here. But because of the changing legal framework and a very clear long-term shift in legal protections of employees, shifting away from protections of employers, this has shifted a bit, right? And so I think, tell me if I got this right, part of our guidance here would be if there are good business safety reasons to drug test, by all means, you should do it, and just be self-aware of kind of the rails and set it up wisely. But just like all requirements of employment, the more you tie it to the actual job requirements and therefore a job description and tying back to your employee handbook, the firmer ground you are on, right? So if you're hiring, so stepping out of the drug context for a second, if you are a bank and you need a Brinks truck driver or a truck driver to move money from bank to bank, pick up cash from locations, it seems reasonable to me to have a requirement that you can't have somebody with a bank felony on their record as a condition of employment, right? Even though you might live in a state that has laws prohibiting you from considering people's criminal background as part. So as long as it's tied to a good business reason for condition of employment, that I think maybe that's the overarching thing we really want people to walk away with here. Is that fair?
Exactly. Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head. And I think that's why you mentioned the shift. And I think there has been a shift away from pre-employment drug testing overall. But when we're talking, we're narrowing it down to the types of positions that it might be required for. And I think, then that leads me to just touch on the other types of, drug testing and alcohol testing that is out there that, again, when we get into these, it does get into specific reasons, right?
Yeah.
That may be, more realistic for a company to employ rather than, pre-employment testing, such as, reasonable suspicion drug testing, right? So this is, for cause or reasonable cause, it's sometimes called, and it's generally permitted in all jurisdictions. And basically, with reasonable suspicion testing, and, this might be an advantage of having this type of policy in existence. It's not that we're going to test everyone, but, if a supervisor, manager has specific observations about, the behavior of someone, right? Smell of alcohol in their breath, slurred speech, unsteady movements, things like that, then, we're going to document those, and that can lead to requiring, a drug test because there's specific, basis to do so. Yeah. Again, I think another one that is employed, which can also avoid the ADA type issues of discrimination, like even reasonable suspicion can, right? Someone can challenge that and say, you're picking on me for some inappropriate, protected reason to test me. Whereas, random drug testing is just, you could use a computer program and that tells you on what day, you're going to be testing which employee, and it's entirely random. The company doesn't, control it other than including who's going to be in that pool of people tested. And again, it makes it, number one, it's an effective deterrent because it's unpredictable, and the lack of the necessary suspicion, right, to trigger the test means that, it's very unlikely there could be a discrimination claim because it by definition, it's random. And now there are some state, local restrictions. We've seen that, random drug testing is entirely barred in some jurisdictions. And in others, like, Minnesota, I believe in Montana, it's restricted to safety-sensitive employees. But again, random drug testing can be, a good alternative to, pre-employment. And then, also, post-accident testing. This is something where I think employers think it sounds very common sense. All right, every time there's an accident, we'll have someone tested for drugs, but it requires a little more nuance than that. Because it should probably be related just to safety sensitive employees. And again, are we going to test everyone for every, injury on the job? That might be, too much and be very costly. And maybe it should only include testing when, the employee was potentially at fault, right? I mean, if someone's driving a forklift and through no fault of their own, someone bumps into them, but it's not that forklift operator's fault, then why are we going to test them? So again,
I can just imagine how dangerous. I can just imagine how dangerous that could be culturally, right? I mean, you might think, okay, I suspected this person is high, right? They go out on their break. I think they're getting high. And so, by gosh, I just caught him in a mistake. I'm going to drug test him. I mean, if you do this in a super consistent way, if it's part of your employee handbook, you've set the expectations as your onboarding process, and you actually do perform drug tests whenever there are quote-unquote mistakes, and you better include clerical mistakes in slips of the tongue. I mean, because what the hell is the definition of a mistake otherwise, right? It's like, this feels like slippery slope kind of territory to me that, I mean, in a world where the war for talent has hit Main Street and we're trying to do our very best to broaden our candidate pool, culturally feels counterintuitive, even though the spirit of the action might be like, I don't want people getting high at work. That seems obvious, right? So how do you give guidance for employers to handle this extremely slippery slope?
Right. So you're spot on in that it is. There are a lot of considerations, and it's not always just the law. Sometimes it's, employee relations. So I think, companies should start minimally with, having a drug-free policy, right?
There you
and, especially with companies with people in, privacy-related roles, with data or safety-sensitive positions, training, once a year, 2-hour training for those types of employees or for everyone for that matter, is a positive thing, right? You're not, we're not using the threat of tests. We're just talking about, explaining to them, drug addiction, things like that, and how it's not permitted, right? Sometimes, it can go a long way to hear that. And it just develops a culture where safety is valued and of both the individual employees and how their actions could affect others. So I think regardless of one's going to implement a drug testing program, that's something to consider. But yes, I think that then if you're a business that's going to consider testing, right, the next question is what type of testing? Pre-employment testing might be too costly, and like you said, when we're just trying to get qualified applicants, is that the message we want to send, right? It might convey the right culture, but again, might we be missing out on talent? So, then again, like we said, reasonable suspicion, that's one that may, lead to potential, discrimination claims because of the somewhat, subjective nature of judging if someone might be high. And again, we want to look at, specific, behaviors, but, that becomes difficult where, then you possibly need to train managers on how to detect it. So, things like, random drug testing too, a negative of that is, look, if you're a small organization, you need to do random drug testing often enough that it's a deterrent. But if your pool of workers is pretty small, you're talking about doing drug testing pretty often, which again, is that what you want to actually be doing? I think post accident in jurisdictions that allow it is a good one. But yeah, look, there are pros and cons to each type of these drug tests, and so it really becomes a weighing of the protections you want to provide, understanding the law in your jurisdiction, and also the culture that you want to create. We want to create a drug-free culture that promotes that, but at the same time, there's more ways to go about it than just requiring drug testing. So,
all right. So I think we've established that We've established, I think, that there are some companies you're required to. You need to find out. If you're not required to, there's still really good reasons why it might be necessary. In our recommendation is that you got to tie the reason for the drug test needs to tie back to a business reason, whether that's safety for themselves, safety for customers, safety for coworkers, whatever the reason is, as long as it's founded in a business reason, you can feel relatively safe. Let's talk about, and then I think it was wise to put then in the culture, in the context of culture, because there's a legal framework here and there's a culture framework here. And you can see this cutting both ways, based on geography, based on industry, based on demographic, where some people are going to want maybe more open culture at work. Some people are going to want just the opposite, right? Depending on different views. And so there's a legal component, there's a cultural component in what culture you're trying to create. So let's kind of shift if we can, because I think there's going to be a long laundry list of recommendations. What are the areas here that businesses get themselves in trouble? So they've made the decision, they're going to do it. What are some of the traps that folks fall into?
Sure. So I think, look, we see a lot of different types of litigation when it comes to these issues. I think one is, use of a medical review officer, because as I mentioned, even when there's a positive, drug test, for instance, with marijuana, right? You might be in a jurisdiction, look, there are many jurisdictions where, medical and recreational marijuana are legal. There are still many where it's not. So, for instance, someone might test positive for marijuana, and that could come back as a positive test. And if we don't have a medical review officer, as the employer, you might say, positive test, you're fired. But the point of this MRO is that they would reach out to the applicant, and perhaps maybe that applicant has a doctor who's prescribed medical marijuana. And so you have these situations where there's not necessarily evidence that they were, using marijuana at work, or that they were even, high at work. Because as we know, marijuana and other drugs can stay in the system for a while and cause a positive drug test even when you're not under the influence.
Right.
So I think we get into situations where employers mechanically, operate with respect to drug tests. But it's very important that, again, bringing back the ADA into the discussion, right? Just as, with, prescription medication, right? We want, there should be an opportunity for the employee to explain, no, this is something that's been prescribed to me. It may be then an accommodation, right, for them to use medical marijuana in this instance. And so, terminating them for a positive drug test under that scenario could prove to be, a trigger for a possible discrimination claim.
Brian,
I think again,
how do we look at this? Do I have this right? Thinking about how an employer should look at it legally. Usually, it's the more restrictive law when you're comparing federal versus state. Because one of the real problems here, right, is marijuana is still illegal federally, right? but then you have state by state making it legal. If this was, say, overtime, federal Fair Labor Standards Act establishes a federal minimum wage, $7.25. But if I'm in a certain state, or if I'm in a city or a county within a state, that it's frequently higher, right? And so the law would say that our guidance to employers is you basically have to follow the most restrictive law. But this is a little bit different. This is counterintuitive, right? Because the most restrictive would say, okay, this is illegal at the federal level. I don't care what my state says. I have to follow federal law here. What's an employer to do?
Yeah, you're exactly right. We're basically in the opposite here, right? Where marijuana is still illegal under federal law. However, since about 2013, the Department of Justice has taken a hands-off approach where, Congress does not permit the Department of Justice to use federal funds to interfere with, state marijuana laws. So you're right. So that's why here it's a patchwork, right? There may also be, there's been some legislation, nothing passed yet to decriminalize marijuana, get it off of the controlled substances list at the federal level. That has not been done yet. Although, President Biden, recently stated a few months back that he wants, a very expeditious review of how marijuana, is and should be scheduled. And then you have, the FDA saying that again, they have a take on it, right? The U.S. Department of Transportation, right? The DOT does not permit, marijuana for any reason. While, for employers who are going to take action, let's say terminate someone for a marijuana positive drug result, here you cannot rely on federal law, right? You can't say, look, it's illegal under federal law, you're fired, or, I'm a federal contractor and you tested positive, you're fired. That's not necessarily the case because we have many, this is one where we're going to look towards the states, and even if they have more expansive views than the federal government, that's what we're going with, right? So, and there are many different laws of how employers can test, right? For instance, in Illinois, for example, right, marijuana is a lawful consumable product. So employers cannot discriminate against an individual who uses a lawful consumable product. And therefore, but also the law contains provisions allowing employers to test for marijuana and take adverse action. So, you have Illinois where it's saying both ways and employers aren't quite sure what to do. Right. Then you have New York, for example, where basically, you cannot test for marijuana, here in New York. So, nationwide, the trend we're seeing is, certainly pre-employment drug testing for marijuana would not be advisable. But then, in terms of once they're an employee, again, given the proliferation of state and local laws that make it lawful to use marijuana off duty, there's been a trend to discontinue, some marijuana testing. Yeah. It's, and then if you get into medical marijuana, that becomes an issue again involving the ADA, where again there's many states where there's going to be a risk of disability discrimination, so that we employers should start thinking about medical marijuana as a prescription for any other anything else, right? And that if you're going to take action based on a medical prescription, that's an issue. Now, again, you might require individuals to disclose if they are taking medical marijuana, or again, if you have people in safety sensitive positions, you might require them to disclose any side effects that certain medication they're on would result in, whether it's drowsiness or other things, right? So that might be a way to have the issue dealt with. That again, as you mentioned earlier, Mike, it's about the work, right? What's the work that they're doing, and how is this impacting it, right? We, just because they're using medical marijuana doesn't mean we can't employ them. It might be, we need to conduct that individualized analysis, engage in the interactive dialogue as we do for accommodations, and see, is there a direct threat? Is the someone on who's using medical marijuana, right? Should they be driving that truck or driving a forklift? Probably not. But again, it's an individualized assessment, and maybe we need to move their shift so that, if they need their medical marijuana, later in the day, that we schedule them for a shift in the morning before they've taken it. And that way they could drive. So just like any other, disability type issue, it's become one that's, going to be dealt with on an individual basis. And, regardless of the jurisdiction a company is in, they really want to look at, the reason why someone's, testing positive for marijuana, and what can be done, whether it's, necessary for some condition or not.
I'm thinking, going back, so we've given guidance on this program so many times around you have to follow the most restrictive law, and I guess I've always envisioned it as subsets of subsets, right? So a city sits within a county sits within a state sits within a federal framework of laws, and so in the case of minimum wage, they're all subsets. You got to do whichever is the highest. In this case, it's not so much as a subset; it's more like Venn diagram of risk, right? It's like if just because it's marijuana might be illegal federally, if my state or my county, my city says it's illegal to test for it, then the local police can still knock on my door. I can be charged with a crime for illegally testing people. And I might be thinking I'm following federal, but that's not going to keep me, maybe a jail is a little too strong, but it's not going to keep me out of trouble locally, right? I'm still going to have to hire folks like you, right?
Right. You're exactly right. This is one where it's the least restrictive law we're going to follow. So, we've seen defenses like that asserted in cases where, a company says, no, it's illegal on the federal level. I can test for it, even though a local law or state law says you can't test for marijuana. And the courts have found, nope, you have to follow that, that state or local law that says you can't test. You cannot rely on the defense that it's allowed federally. So, that's exactly right. It can be a little confusing because it's the exact opposite of how we look at employment law. Basically, as far as I can think, in almost every other situation. But when it comes to testing for marijuana, we're really looking at the state and local level, regardless of whether it conflicts with the federal law.
Brent, I'm curious about, and I'm going to switch topics on you slightly. Invasion of privacy, right? So, I'm an employee. I have my drug of choice, whether legal in my state or not. But I'm really good at my job, and you either want to use it as a condition of pre-employment or employment. For some reason, you want to drug test me. I'm like, that's none of your business. What legal ground does the employee have to stand on? Because clearly, the laws we already said it. The laws are continuing to shift to provide more protections for employees than employers. So how firm is the ground of the employee to say, hey, no, I'm not taking your test because I think it's stupid? Or does the employer say, hey, you don't have to agree with me, this is the policy that we've chosen, and here's why, and you will or you won't be here. Walk us through this whole invasion of privacy thing.
Excellent question. So there are a number of states that we call "quote unquote" privacy states, such as California, Massachusetts, New Jersey, to name a few, where those are states that recognize this real privacy right for employees in the context of workplace substance abuse testing, and so in those states, they have much stronger restrictions on, who can be tested and in what circumstances. So, earlier we were talking about random, drug testing, which, seems like, in terms at least of ADA issues, a very good alternative to some of the other more targeted tests. But even in those privacy states, because they recognize this privacy right, they are going to limit, even random testing is only limited to safety-sensitive employees. Safety, privacy rather is, one of those issues that, again, that's one of the reasons that some states have these restrictions. And again, even in, I believe, those same three states, California, Massachusetts, New Jersey, when it comes to, post-accident testing, again, they're limiting post-accident testing to only safety-sensitive employees. I think that privacy issue is a big one to consider because it's, look, again, it depends on the jurisdiction, but it is a real, right that certain states, and I think more and more, are recognizing that even though you're an employee, someone's an employee, it's at will, that they still have some rights and protections when it comes to drug testing.
Different topic. So you've decided, you've watched this show, and now you're super smart and you're informed, and you've made a clear decision. Drug testing is an important thing for our organization, for the safety of our employees and our clients, and we're going to implement it. Now, how do we implement it? I mean, do you get to go to CSV or Walgreens and grab some kits and say, hey, go pee in the cup in the bathroom? Are there certified labs that you have to use? You've referenced using was it the MRO? I believe. Unpack this for us for how employers should, especially small businesses, right? That this is an important thing. They've decided to do it. How should they do it?
Right. So to be clear, and I know you're joking, we're not walking into your local drugstore and buying drug testing kits. Right. This is not one of the areas of do it yourself drug testing. Yeah. Right. So I think, look, obviously the first step is understanding what laws and restrictions there are in both based on your company's industry, whether there are certain requirements or restrictions, and then also based on your jurisdiction just in general, what the take is on these substance tests. And then once you're there, then the next question, as we discussed, is what type of drug tests you want to do, whether it's pre-employment, random, post-accident, and again, seek guidance on this would be my best advice to employers. Speak to an experienced HR person at Assure, for instance, who has dealt with this issue before and can talk you through the pros and cons of each type. But then the most important part of it is having a written policy, right? So this is not something where, for instance, we're doing reasonable suspicion drug testing, and all right, one day we think that, John Doe is high at work for some articulable reasons. We're gonna just look online, find a drug testing place, say, hey, we got someone, can we send him over there? Right now, this is something where you need to have planned out procedures for how it's going to operate. You're going to have a drug testing vendor that you're set up with. The company has an account, because this is something where when someone needs to be tested, it's pretty immediate. And when we say immediate, it's the person is dropping everything they're doing, and every step that they take after they're notified of a drug test is towards getting that drug test. And look, there are complications, right? And this is why policies are important, right? What if it's reasonable suspicion? That means you think someone is potentially high. We can't just tell them to go drive off site. We need to have a policy for how they're going to be escorted there. We think you're so inebriated that you can't run this machine. So go hop into your car and get tested, right? Right. And look, I can tell you, I've seen crazy things when it comes to this. I mean, look, I've seen companies that had a written drug testing policy in place, but they never thought to take the next step and set up an account with a vendor and figure out the logistics of how a drug test would occur. So that, because we said when someone needs to be tested, it needs to be immediate. And if you wait, you have to wait a day because you're not in that vendor system, that drug tester system, then what's the point of the drug test? Something's going to be out of their system by that point, whether, alcohol or potentially drugs. So, right, it's about having the policy in place that's employee facing, allows them to understand under what circumstances they might be subject to a drug test and how it will occur. And then internally, the company needs to have a well thought out and documented procedure so that, from the moment, the supervisor comes to HR and says, John Doe is slurring his speech, his eyes are, red, and, he seems, to not really have his balance when he was standing. What are we doing, right? The first step, maybe we're having, getting him into a conference room, right? Away from, anyone else where he might, present, a threat of harm. And then, what are the next steps? Because, just like, any other, urgent workplace matter, it's even if we haven't come across it before or had to deal with it, it's best to have a plan in place, because I've seen these situations develop for companies that don't have a plan in place. And, the big issue there is that, if you don't have the right processes, even if you get that drug test done and it comes back positive, there might have been steps you skipped, and then you're going to make a workplace, you're going to terminate this person based on that positive result. But, maybe we've skipped a few steps and we haven't followed our policy to a T because we were just scrambling. So I think this is an area where, there's this upfront, time and expense of, putting the policy and everything together. But that way it's going to be ready for when it needs to be employed, that, those, supervisors, HR, they're going to know what to do and how to do it and what steps to take. And as we say about basically everything in employment law, right, the documentation, right, for reasonable suspicion, for instance, right, it's one thing to be able to articulate why we're sending this person to a test, but again, given the risk of discrimination claims and other types of claims, we want to document that. We want to write that down so that, we have documented reasons why they were sent. So I think, those are things. And one other thing I'll mention is that some companies might have customers that require this. So it might be something that a business has to do if you do business with certain customers. And, again, then it certainly makes it, worthwhile, economically, financially, for a company to do it and to make sure you're doing it the right way.
Okay, this is a super edge case, but what do you do? So this framework of which law do I follow, federal versus state versus local, Local law says I can't test for marijuana. My customer, I have a contract with my customer, and that customer is in a different state. And for whatever reason, the contract with them says they won't do business with anybody who doesn't drug test all of their employees. What, do I have to fire that customer? Or am I now on firm ground, quote unquote, breaking state law because it's a customer requirement, not my requirement?
Right. So what I would say is that you're probably leaning towards following your own state law, and that, that issue should be discussed with, your customer, before entering that agreement. But, look, what I can also say is that in many of these states right now, like I mentioned, Illinois, for instance, it's a little unclear, right? That some states even have, laws that don't appear to make sense in terms of clear cut advice on whether you can test for marijuana or not. And so I think, the best advice would be to follow the state law that, following a customer contract. Typically we can't contract around, state laws,
right.
But,
right.
To add another wrinkle to that, if you're sending employees to work in that other state for that customer, and they would be tested in that other state where it might not be allowed, or
right.
rather medical or marijuana testing might be allowed, whereas it isn't in the company's home state, then it might be okay. But again, this is such a fluid situation with laws that, we have laws that are, yet to take effect or just coming into effect. And so, I think the general advice when it comes to, marijuana testing, and is really that, the adverse actions, whether it's okay, are really going to depend on whether it's, recreational versus medical. Medical is obviously going to add some protections because of the ADA. And it's going to be based on state and local law. So it's real important to...
Brian, my last legal question before I try to recap this, because I know we're bumping up this time here. In cases where the law conflicts, so just like you're saying, if this is and I don't want to get into some crazy nuance edge cases that anybody watching the show is going to say, well, that doesn't apply to me. But I'm assuming that if this goes before a judge, you're sued, you're charged, you end up in hot water. I'm assuming that I shouldn't assume. I'm asking your experience. Do judges, the authorities within, say it's DOL or whomever is deciding these cases, do they take into consideration best efforts of the employer and acknowledge, okay, this is for a medical reason, it conflicts with this law but not this law, and we did our best, and here's our documentation? How much does good intent and good documentation, goodwill get you versus... I guess I'll stop there. Maybe comment for me.
Yeah, so I think, look, at a minimum, a company who can show, good faith efforts, even if there may be some exposure or liability, for instance, for, an improper drug test or for, possible, discrimination type issues, that good faith is always, is often going to be something you can use, if not directly towards liability, towards reduction of potential, penalties and damages. But I think here, when it comes to the conflict, the case law that we are seeing is really that companies can't rely on the federal law. So, if you are a company that, or an individual that owns a company that is really, anti-marijuana, which, there are many out there, and there may be very good reasons for that too. But that if your position in doing drug testing or taking actions, is in conflict with your local jurisdiction, and you're going to rely on, well, it's a controlled substance at the federal level, it's still illegal. We have seen that those arguments are not going to fly. It's in that regard, it's much different than the wage and hour law, things like that, where again, you can't rely on the most restrictive. The courts are showing a very clear path that they're going to rely on the whatever the local law says, even if that's saying marijuana is like in New York, no testing for marijuana, right? As an employer, you can't say, well, I'm not in favor of that, and because it's illegal under federal law, I'm testing. It's just not going to really fly anymore.
So I know we're at time. I think maybe I want you to correct me if I'm wrong. I'm going to do my best to recap the conversation. So first and foremost, you got to find whether you're an employer who is legally required to drug test. There is legislation around this. If so, you probably already know who you are. But generally, around public safety is the area. Second, for those companies who are not legally required to drug test but considering it, just understand the context of your decision. There is a cultural sea change, and you need to attract talent, and you need to be open-minded about where that talent comes from. And this is not going away. We talk about this all the time on the show. But then number two, assuming you've established good business reasons, safety of customers, safety of employees, whatever the reason may be, that you have decided you're going to do drug testing, then you got to avoid some of the big pitfalls. You got to have a super consistent process and consistent expectations. So if you can't do pre-employment drug testing for one person and not another person, you can't do pre-employment drug testing too far upstream because you might be kicking candidates out in a discriminatory way without even realizing it. Most people aren't going to do that because it's an unnecessary expense. You generally only are drug testing people you're actually offering the job to. But if it's during employment, whether it's an immediate reaction to an accident, whether it's random, so long as you have really clear written policies on this, aka have a good handbook that's updated and communicated in the policies within are trained upon on a regular basis, and then you apply those policies in a super consistent, transparent way, and you're using the best practices. You're not going to Walgreens and buying a cup for someone to go into the bathroom with and self-administering. You're using medical professionals and clinics and labs. Then you can be on solid ground, but this is a topic that we should all be super aware is fluid, right? And as much as we do our best on the show to provide black and white concrete advice for employers, this is shifting ground, and I think it's going to remain shifting ground for several years just because of the inherent conflicts we have today between federal and state laws. Did I capture it, Brian?
Absolutely. Couldn't have wrapped that up better myself.
Yeah. Okay, so employers, we know this can be confusing. You still need to provide a safe workplace for employees, employees for clients, and just acknowledge there's a difference between drug policies and you can't have it in your system versus nothing today suggested that it would ever be okay to be high or drunk at work. You can't drink on the job while running a fork truck. The same way you can't go out and get high during your lunch break and come back and run the fork truck. So none of this is saying marijuana bad, alcohol good, because you can't drink on the job either, right? This is all about whether you can use these substances obviously outside of work, and is that in fact legal, and what can you do about it to provide the kind of culture you want to grow your business in a way that's safe and compliant with the law. So, Brian, love talking to you. I always learn something from you, and everyone else, thanks for joining us today. Until next week, we'll talk to you soon.
At Assure, we build human capital management software and services that help 90,000 companies like yours attract, develop, and retain great people. Our low upfront costs and affordable subscription model allow you to save cash to invest in things that drive growth, not overhead. To learn more about how Assure can help you claim up to $26,000 per employee with the Employee Retention Tax Credit, automate your payroll, and build productive teams that are compliant with ever-changing HR laws, visit AssureSoftware.com.